America didn't just win the Cold War with missiles, aircraft, or nuclear power. It won in a way no one expected, not on battlefields, not in secret operations, but in something so ordinary that most Americans never even noticed it. Because while the Soviet Union was building weapons and spreading ideology, the United States was quietly building something far more powerful, a way of life so advanced, so abundant, that when people from the other side finally saw it with their own eyes, it shattered everything they believed. And for one Soviet pilot, that moment didn't happen in the sky. It happened in a supermarket.
His name was Viktor Belenko, a highly trained MiG-25 pilot, trusted with one of the most advanced aircraft in the entire Soviet arsenal. In 1976, he made a decision that shocked the world. He defected. He flew his fighter jet out of the Soviet Union and landed in Japan, risking execution, risking everything he had ever known just for a chance to escape. When he arrived in the United States shortly after, he expected to see a powerful enemy. Advanced, yes, but still fundamentally flawed, just as he had been taught his entire life. He had studied American technology, seen their aircraft, understood their military capabilities. And from a technical perspective, he already knew the truth. America was ahead. But what he didn't understand was how deep that difference really went. From the moment he arrived, things didn't make sense. Flying over the United States, he looked down and saw highways stretching endlessly, filled with cars, not military vehicles, not government convoys, but ordinary people, each owning something that in the Soviet Union would represent years of savings. When he was taken to a safe house in Virginia, he saw something even more confusing. A normal home, not luxurious, not reserved for elites, but a standard suburban house with multiple rooms, heating, air conditioning, and a refrigerator that was completely full. Not partially filled with rationed goods, but overflowing with fresh food. Fruits, vegetables, meat, things his family could spend weeks trying to find back home. He assumed it was staged, something prepared for defectors, a carefully constructed illusion. But the answer he received was simple and almost impossible to accept. This was normal. Because where he came from, normal life looked very different. In the Soviet Union, you didn't walk into a store and choose what you wanted. You waited. You stood in lines for hours, sometimes without even knowing what was being sold, hoping that whatever arrived that day would be something you needed. Bread required patience. Meat was inconsistent. Shoes came in limited options, and if your size wasn't available, you adapted, forcing them to fit no matter how uncomfortable they were. Choice didn't exist in the way Americans understood it. And yet, despite all of this, he had been taught something completely different. He had been taught that America was struggling, that its abundance was exaggerated, that capitalist society was built on illusion, while the Soviet system, despite temporary shortages, was moving toward a better future. For years after his defection, he adjusted to life in America. He learned the language, worked alongside engineers, visited factories, and saw firsthand the technological gap between the two nations. He accepted that the United States was more advanced, more productive, more efficient. But understanding something intellectually is very different from feeling it. And it wasn't until 1989, more than a decade after he had escaped, that everything finally became real. That day, he walked into a supermarket in Houston, Texas. It was nothing special. Just a regular grocery store, the kind millions of Americans visited every week without a second thought. The doors opened automatically as he approached, a small detail that already felt unfamiliar, and as he stepped inside, he stopped. In front of him were aisles that seemed to stretch endlessly, filled with more food than he had ever seen in one place in his entire life. Fresh produce in quantities he couldn't comprehend, fruits imported from countries he had been told were struggling under American influence, meat displayed in dozens of different cuts, everything clean, organized, and always available. This wasn't a shipment that had just arrived. This wasn't luck. This was constant. Then he reached the cereal aisle, and something inside him broke. He stood there, staring at the shelves, trying to process what he was seeing, and began to count. 10, 20, 30, 50. 50 different types of cereal, each with its own brand, flavor, and design, competing for attention. Not 50 boxes of the same thing, but 50 completely different options. In the Soviet Union, finding even 2 or 3 types was considered fortunate. Here, there were 50, casually sitting on shelves, available to anyone who walked in. The sheer variety made no sense. The idea that ordinary people could choose between so many options, not because they needed to, but simply because they could, was overwhelming. Standing there, surrounded by something so simple yet so impossible, Viktor Belenko began to cry, not because of the food itself, but because of what it represented. In that moment, the years of propaganda, the lessons, the explanations, the justifications, all of it collapsed. "Everything they told us was a lie," he said quietly. And it wasn't just about supermarkets. It wasn't just about consumer goods. It was about an entire system built on controlling what people could see, what they could compare, and what they were allowed to believe. What shocked him the most wasn't the existence of abundance, but how normal it was. No one in the store seemed impressed. No one stopped to stare. People walked in, picked what they wanted, and left, as if this level of choice and availability was the most ordinary thing in the world. And that was the real difference. In the Soviet Union, scarcity was normal. In America, abundance was. And Viktor Belenko wasn't the only one to experience this. Again and again, Soviet visitors, scientists, diplomats, and even high-ranking officials encountered the same reality when they traveled to the West. It wasn't military demonstrations that changed their perception. It wasn't classified technology. It was everyday life. Supermarkets, clothing stores, electronics, simple things that revealed a truth that couldn't be explained away. The gap between the two systems wasn't hidden in secret documents. It was visible to anyone who walked through a store. In the end, the Cold War wasn't decided only by weapons or strategy. It was decided by something far more powerful: reality itself. Because when people finally saw how others lived, when they experienced it directly, no amount of propaganda could compete with it. And for one Soviet pilot, that realization didn't come from the cockpit of a fighter jet, but from standing in silence in the middle of a grocery store, surrounded by something he had never truly understood until that moment: freedom of choice.